Thank you. Good evening, everyone. My name's Dan. I'm a resident at the Monastic Academy, where we train intensively in mindfulness, meditation, and leadership skills, and the integration of the two. I've been a resident for about 9.5 months now, and I've seen some people come and go. Not a lot, but some. And the trend seems to be that for most of the people I've seen that have shown up, there's a sense of eagerness, maybe a little naivety, excitement, eagerness to throw oneself into the work, deepen their meditation practice, take on more leadership skills. So generally, like a feeling of brightness, excitement, hopefulness. I was not one of these people at all. When I showed up at the Monastic Academy, I was terrified, and if you ask Danny over here, he will tell you that for at least the first week I was there, I had this hilarious look of terror on my face. And pretty much the reason was that I was wondering what the heck I had just gotten myself into. When I arrived, it was hard to form clear expectations about what I was doing. I hadn't visited the place. Miles, who some of you met, was a past resident, encouraged me. I asked him, do you think I should come and visit for a weekend, or should I just jump in? He was like, oh, everybody who comes and visits for a weekend loves it. You might as well just go for it. So I listened to him. And had I not listened to him, I very well might not be sitting in front of you right now, because if I came for just the weekend, given my first few days at the Monastic Academy, I probably would have left and not come back. But I'm glad I stayed. One of the things that happened when I got really freaked out and stunned about this place, where they talk about, some of you know Shinzen Young, he has this unified mindfulness system, which is pretty integrated into the Monastic Academy's teaching style. I didn't know anything about it, so hearing words like nurture positive and feel out when talking about meditation sounded like this weird alien language that I was not familiar with. So I felt really out of place and immediately started wondering whether I should stay or leave. And this was a really important question for me, and I felt like I came to a major fork in the road in my life, where if I left, I had no plan B, and if I stayed, I was getting into something where I had no idea what the consequences were. One day, a few days into my first week, I started out on the buildings and grounds crew. Django over here, who's in charge of the B&G crew, handed me a mop and had me mopping the floor. And I was once again ambushed by this question of whether I should stay or leave. I was really obsessed with it and really panicked about it, when I had somewhat of an insight which expressed itself in a thought that went something like this: dude, just mop the floor. I realized in that moment that I didn't need to solve this conundrum of whether to stay or leave. Mindfulness and the reason I came there had nothing to do with this duality. I was completely stuck in my head, totally in these concepts about what would happen if I stayed, playing out the scenarios, what would happen if I leave, playing out the scenarios, desperate for some sense of certainty about what I was going to do. And then it was just like clear and simple, cut through it, that is complete delusion, like you're mopping the floor and you're up here watching television of this huge drama. And that, you could say, has been a huge lesson that has grown and grown over the last 9.5 months, that really all we're doing here is unhooking ourselves from the need for certainty. And when we train in meditation at the Monastic Academy, that is the training. So often there's this tendency to want to freeze up and solidify our experience into some neat little story that, pretty much carries us along blindly. And for that moment, in seeing the clarity that it actually had nothing to do with that certainty and that was completely fooling myself, I let go. And since then, the process has been continually letting go every time I try to find certainty or try to find some sense of what I'm doing here. The need for certainty is really deep. When you sit and meditate a lot of hours, you see how desperately your mind tries to come up with some story to fit everything into. And The reason we seek certainty is because it's safe. And without any sense of certainty, we have to acknowledge the fact that we're not in control of things. When you meditate a lot of hours, as we do at the monastery, it becomes really clear pretty soon, and you actually don't even need very much meditation experience to see clearly that you're not in control of what you experience. You're sitting there and all kinds of thoughts and sensations start coming up. Emotions, memories, sights, sounds, feelings, and you're not conducting any of it. In fact, if you look for a conductor, you won't find one. So there's uncertainty at that level, which is that you don't get to choose anything that comes through your mind, anything that comes through your body. And then at a deeper level, as you sit more and more, when you actually look into these experiences and you try to find some sense of solidity to them, you don't. This is easy to do with certain emotions. If you actually look into what it feels like to feel angry, there's a feeling in the body, prickliness, hotness, heaviness. And if you look into the mind, you see faces contorted, maybe images of people flailing their arms or something. But if you actually look for anger, you don't find anything. You just find these isolated experiences that have combined for a moment, and then there's this concept, anger, that if you actually look into that, it's a sound. It's anger. It's an idea in the mind, and then if you define it, that's just more ideas and more ideas. So this is one way of talking about what in Buddhism is called emptiness, that there's no fundamental essence to anything you experience. It's aggregations of aggregations. So there's not even certainty in any single thing that you experience, because if you look into it, you just see this unending flow, and you can't catch it and ask it if it's certain, because by the time you've done that, it's gone. We practice letting go, we practice dropping into that flow of experience, and Soryu shared with me a number of months ago, every day at the Monastic Academy, we have interviews with the teacher, which means we have a period of practice where we're sitting and meditating, he rings a bell, and one by one we all come in and we sit in front of him and we get one-on-one meditation instruction. So one day I went in there and I don't remember exactly what I brought to him, but I remember the image he shared with me, which was that our practice is like a river flowing through the forest. And everything that arises, the emotions, the sensations, is the scenery. There's a lot to say about this, and this has been something that's been informing me over the last few months and something that keeps coming up. But the basic idea is that whatever arises, it doesn't matter if you get caught up in some storyline or if there's some big important thing that you feel like you need to fix, you just come back to the technique. You keep coming back to the technique and you find that there's a rhythm in that and a flow to it. And the more you kind of drop into it, the more you're able to let go. And some of us have probably had experiences like that, where you're meditating and you're coming to the breath, and then maybe you decide to take a chance and just drop the technique for a moment, and it just carries itself. And that can be really wonderful when you're sitting there and suddenly you're meditating and you don't need to do anything. It's like you're just tubing down a river. Now, inherently, in moments like that, you become aware that you're actually not in control, which is both exhilarating and terrifying. For some reason, we have the habit of focusing on the fact that it's terrifying, and we would prefer to cling to the riverbank and kick and scream and fight against the flow of the river and fool ourselves into thinking that we have some sense of certainty holding onto this little shrub that's actually eroding into the river as you're holding onto it, kicking and screaming. And so there's a lot of fear and a lot of doubt and a lot of hesitation. We don't want to lose that sense of control. We don't want to lose that sense of safety. But the thing is, no matter what, you're going to. The riverbank is eroding. So the question is, do you lose it willingly? Do you give it up? Do you let go? Or do you have it pulled away from you? Another way of thinking of this is, do you cling to the tree on the riverbank kicking and screaming, or do you go tubing? And it can feel like that. It can actually feel like really exciting and exhilarating when you're sitting and you're being carried along, and it's almost effortless. This habit to cling and resist and fight against the flow is really strong and really deep. And when you look into it, you might find that it's actually, to a large extent, rooted in the body. And there's a lot of tension I've found in my body. As I start cutting through some of the outer layers, the thinking and all the noise my mind's making, and it starts to settle down, you can feel that there are points in the body that aren't ready to let go. And they really hold on. And when you add it all together, it feels like this solid mass. And perhaps there's a feeling of spaciousness or flow, but there's in the center of it like this block of ice. And this is just habit, a lot of habit energy building up, getting stuck in the body, not ready to let go. A funny thing happened a few months ago with, I think it was in our June retreat, where Danny Joseph shared an image with me, or with the group, that actually a couple weeks before that I had the exact same image come up in mind, and it was funny just seeing that we had the same thing arise at separate occasions. But basically, when you're holding on and resisting your experience, it's as if you're walking through the forest with a giant fish net behind you. You could be having a wonderful experience strolling through the woods, relaxed, enjoying the scenery, but instead you're dragging everything you walk by behind you, trying to capture it all, bringing it to God knows where. And the net effect is that it's drudgery, it's heavy, it's painful, and you suffer. So with practice, with coming back to the technique, learning how to, no matter what's arising in your experience, let go, come back into the flow of the breath, come back into the flow of whatever technique you're doing, that sense of solidity can start to loosen up. As that starts to loosen up, space can start to open up. And you could be sitting there and a pattern might come up that you're really used to. One thing that came up for me in the last retreat was this pattern of self-victimization. And when I say that, the more I looked into it, the more I saw that really all I was experiencing was this look in my face. It was something like this. And then this feeling in my chest and my stomach that was something like this. And then these sounds that were just like, I can't do it, it's too hard. And then there were images in mind of like my inner avatar like collapsing in and turning away, and it's all covered in shadows, and it was just too hard and difficult. And actually, just by seeing all this like components of what I was calling self-victimization, I was sitting in the interview room telling Soryu about this, and I was just laughing because it was just like, what's the big deal? It was just moving parts. There was like whatever I was looking at and thinking was like this heavy machine was just a bunch of gears. So it's really liberating. And when there's space and when you allow space for the breath to come in and for the space to start opening up, these patterns can start to come up. And they come up and they come up and they diminish and they diminish and they come up and diminish. And there's a rhythm to it. And what I was seeing was that it was like I could see that this was the reverse process of the rehearsal that trained that into me. It was because it was coming up into awareness and there was laughter and humor, there was release. Space is really important, and allowing it in your practice can allow deeper stuff that was formerly you were too thick in your head to let it start bubbling up, but as soon as this started to settle down and you came down into your body, it would actually start coming up. And this is a rhythmic pattern, as some say, the subtle becomes gross and the gross becomes subtle. There's spaciousness, there's release, and still there's a tendency to want to hold on to that experience. And quite recently, also in the last retreat, I had a lot of spaciousness coming up during one of my sits, and there was a point where, so I think, it's really subtle, as I've heard the sense of self can get really subtle. I was hearing the sound of a bird and there was no reference point. It was just there was the sound of a bird and that was it. It wasn't like someone pitching to the catcher. It was just like the ball being thrown. And there's just this dance of phenomena. It doesn't have a center, and the space, even when you feel yourself, it's just like this congealed mass in an ocean that actually has nothing to do with you. And when you have wonderful experiences like that, and it's really illuminating, the tendency immediately starts to come up to want to grab onto it and hold it and make it permanent. And an image came up for me recently that it was as if I was sitting and practicing with a video camera. And I was like this, I was filming my experience, and then that started to happen, and I started running the reel. And as soon as it ended, and it ended because I was filming it, by the way, I took the reel off. I started playing it over and over again to myself for like hours after that sit. I was like, I remember during the exercise period we had that morning, I was just like thinking about it, and I knew that I was thinking about it, and I was like, this is not as easy as it looks. Just letting go and being in these spaces, they tend to freeze up because they're so enticing and compelling. And it's like I went into the interview room and told Soryu all about that, and it kind of fell flat because I could tell that I had just dragged in this previous experience I had that he's not interested in. He's interested, as he said recently, in how I open the door, how I step through the threshold, how I close the door, how I pick up the stool, put it on the mat. But here I am, I'm just like, I just had this incredible, I burst through the door, like I had no regard for any mindfulness in entering the interview room. I was just really excited to share what I experienced. This is one place where you could say having a sense of discipline about practice comes in, because no matter how wonderful your experiences are, how glorious a sense of space or calm or equanimity is, you still need to come back. You still need to come back to the technique, and you need to let go in that direction. Because if you don't, and you go into these experiences, something happens which I've heard is called getting drunk on nirvana, which is that you kind of just neglect your practice and you get zonked out in some meditative absorption state and forget that because you're losing it, it's going to congeal, and whatever idea you had of it is going to freeze and dissolve, and you're going to feel like you lost some wonderful experience, but it wasn't yours. It was just you were clinging to some concept that was inevitably going to fade. So pretty much all of what I'm talking about is one way to think of what's called the middle way, where you don't buy into extremes when you have certain ideas about your experience. Whether, for example, in the instance of the story I shared of the mopping, there was this idea of staying and all the things associated with that, and there was the idea of leaving and all the things associated with that, and then there was plain and simple mopping the floor. The middle way is extremely ordinary. We often go into meditation looking for something extraordinary to happen, and it can happen, and if you meditate a lot, it probably will, although there's no guarantee. I actually shouldn't say probably, because I have no idea what the statistics are in a situation like this, but it might happen if you apply what's called right effort. But that's the rare circumstance. 99% of the time you're meditating, it's very ordinary, and it's groundwork. You're working with the breath, this breath, going out, nothing particularly miraculous happens, and then it dissolves, and the next one comes and it goes out, and maybe you find yourself thinking about how you wish it was a more interesting experience and you're trying to get to it, and then you notice this habit of like ambition, trying to have this wonderful experience, and there's not much you can do about it because it's just another thing that arises and diminishes. The same with whatever magical experiences arise. Pretty much what I'm saying is that this middle way, this river flowing through the forest, is the experience of meditation. And sometimes the flow is ordinary and slow, sometimes it's wide and vast, sometimes there are rapids and turbulence, but the point is that you just keep getting into the water because it's better than clinging to a shore that's going to diminish anyway. So with that, I think it's a good time to switch into some practice. So do I ring some bells?
We get in our tubes.
All right, got your tubes. By the way, if you guys want to sit on the floor, there's some cushions over there. So let's take a moment to... If anyone wants to get water, there's some cups above the sink. You're welcome to do so now. So you can begin by aligning your posture and relaxing into that. As if your spine is a stack of coins. And start attending to your breathing. You can do so at the nostril, the mouth, if you're breathing through your mouth, or in the belly, or really anywhere in the body that you feel it most strongly. Noting that the breath has a flow of its own. It starts out small, flowing in, then it expands, and then it's small again. And it goes out, and it expands, and then it's small again. If you'd like, you can use the labels, breathing in, breathing out, or any other label that seems to fit. If you're feeling your belly, you could feel the belly rise and fall. So you could say rising and falling. This is helpful to actually use the concepts and ideas that tend to come up around the practice to direct that mental energy back into the flow of this moment. All kinds of things will arise. If you find yourself getting distracted, pulled away into something, you can label that thinking, and then just return to rising and falling breath. what you're thinking about might seem very important. That's fine. You can still just label it thinking and come back to the breath. It's fairly mundane work. That's okay. We can just keep coming back to the ordinary flow of the breath. And again, if you find yourself getting distracted, wanting something more fantastic, fireworks, you can just use the label rising and falling. It may happen that an emotion or some thought with a particularly strong allure to it comes up, as often happens. If so, and you feel called to attend to it, you can do that. In which case you could look into the feeling that arises in the body as best you can. Any images that come up, just notice what you see. Could be faces contorting in a certain way, or bodies aligning in angry postures or whatever, or sounds, which is verbal thought. There's no need to ignore stronger thoughts or emotions. In fact, you can put your attention on them and see that they are flow. And eventually they can lead you back to the breath. In a few moments, I'm going to ring the bell, and we'll have several minutes for walking. I'd like to encourage you guys to continue the technique, come back to the in and out of the breath, and flow with the walking. And again, if you find yourself getting caught up in thought, struggling with something, struggling to stay on the breath, you just note that for what it is, no more, no less, and just come back to the breath. So we'll continue with the breath as the object of focus, but we'll add a little variation. Instead of noting both the in and out breath, we're going to change to emphasizing the out breath. In particular, when we exhale, we go out with the breath, as best we can, identifying with the breath, becoming the breath, going out, and dissolving into the space around us. And at that point, just let go of the breath entirely. So in this way, we have our technique, coming back to the out breath, go out, dissolve, and then we let go. So once again, allowing the in-breath to happen naturally, not forcing it, not even particularly paying attention to it. And then when we're ready, coming back to the out-breath, going out, and dissolve into space. In doing this, we cultivate our technique, some kind of discipline, repetition, coming back to the practice, but also cultivate a sense of letting go. We don't cling even to the breath. Just go out, allow a gap, go out, allow a gap, and so on. And if you like, and you find yourself distracted, you can continue to use the label thinking, and then returning to the out-breath. we can continue to cultivate a sense of spaciousness, openness, by becoming the out-breath as it goes out, dissolving into air, and inviting the possibility that space might pervade our experience. Might be that you allow this gap, open the windows if you will, and the room is still stuffy. If so, that's what it is. That happens to be what's filling the space right now. It doesn't have to be open and flowing. It could be stuck and still. So now we have about 20 minutes or so for any questions about the talk, any sharing of experiences about the practice, anything whatsoever.
I'd like to thank you for sharing your personal story about what it's like for you to do what you're doing and how you got started. Even though I have had no such experience whatsoever, I still identified with some of the stuff, and then also in your talk about letting go, identify with that a lot too. My whole life has been about letting go, from the very beginning, and my inability to let go, and the struggle with that, the back and forth. I think that's, it's part of the human condition, at least for me it is. And I understand, that value, that clinging on is not the answer at all. It's not going to bring me anything. It's not going to bring me happiness. And I've experienced that, a joy, from and an exhilaration too. From when you do have those moments where you completely let go, there's an exhilaration. For me, anyways, I got like an exhilaration. Very, very good talk. I like your honesty, and it's like it's not complicated. Really. It's just like doing, right? It's just doing. So it's good to hear. It's good to hear that. Really, for me, it's just a lot of it just boils down to just the basic groundwork, like you're saying, just doing it. Mm-hmm. That's powerful. Mm-hmm. There's so many distractions, bing bang, bing bang, bing bang, all over the place, and mop the goddamn floor.
Simple as that.
What a concept.
Yeah, I had a retreat back in April that was probably the most difficult, challenging retreat I've had since I've been here. Just a lot of struggle and failing to stay with any kind of focus space. And by the end of the week, my body just felt like this bag of hot garbage. I was so worn out. I had sat all night the night before, and during the self-practice period, I decided to take a nap. And when I woke up and went back to sit for the sitting period, I just put my attention here, and that was it. And I was like, oh, so the challenge isn't that it's hard, it's that it's so simple that I'm overshooting it. And I spent the entire week just struggling to get here. So it can really be a challenge, and in the moments when you do kind of settle down and realize that how simple the practices of really just following the breath, for example, it does, and you do go into that, it does feel, it can feel wonderful. And I remember early on, one of my first retreats at the Monastic Academy, there was a moment where for the first time I actually felt like I could let go, and it actually felt like floating gently down a river. There was a very, that was exactly what it felt like. There was this gentle current pushing me along. And of course that doesn't last forever because it's an experience, and as it is, experience comes and goes, even experiences of flow. So it's funny seeing that there are those moments that we call flow, and then there's distraction. So it's like we have flow and then there's not flow. But what we forget is that is flow. There is like that greater sense of flow that you go through periods of wonder and peace and calm, and then there are periods of chaos and confusion, and then the peace and calm comes back. It's all in constant, no matter how wonderful and flowing your experience seems to be. So thank you for sharing that.
Well, I want to thank you for the talk today, and I can't say that I know you, but I think it was probably, my impression is that it was worth the 9.5 months you just because, you started talking and all of a sudden it just, I saw this blossoming of compassion for yourself and confidence as well. So I think, I guess that's what the intent of building leadership and compassion for the world is about. And secondly, I really liked the river, because I often concentrate on breathing in and breathing out, and it just feels like floating in a river to me.
Mm-hmm.
But the aspect that was added for me today was the thoughts that come, or the scenery just going by. And probably one of the best meditative experiences of my life was when I had the opportunity to take a raft trip down the Colorado River. And so it was kind of, when thoughts intruded on this meditation, I could just say, I'm floating, and then, bighorn sheep, and go on. So that I didn't even have to deal with whatever thoughts were coming, just turn them into scenery.
Yeah, it's a useful image.
That was very effective.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. You kind of blew me away, because as is common when I watch the residents give their talks, I remember, I'm thinking, was it 9 months ago when we did the circling exercise together? And I'm like, oh my God, I'm looking at a completely different person. And it's just mind-boggling. It's just the power of the practice is just right before me, and it's really impressive. And when you said about, it was so funny when you were saying about how you have that feeling inside you that it's like, I can't do it, it's too hard. Because I really identify with that. The thing that was coming when something I had to do with our taxes, and this whole feeling inside me going, no, I can't do it. But so it was good to sort of be able to let go, with each out breath of that, kind of laughing a little bit about that. But I had this experience because I've been practicing more lately, and I've been taking voice lessons to change my voice, and that same thing where I've been trying really hard to change my voice, I really want it to sound slower and deeper, and and then I just slipped into meditation in this one exercise I did with this lady, and all of a sudden it was oh, it's just about relaxing. That's how it is. It's relaxing, your voice calms down. And it was just it just happened. It just I slipped into it, just like that open door just slipped right in. And I was like, oh my God, a breakthrough. It was just such a funny, yeah, so I kind of related that to that feeling of, oh, so simple. But
Yeah. I found that a lot of the pain and tension in here and the holding on, that the more I look into it, I realize that I'm struggling against it. Like, I don't want to have this feeling, and that's why it's like that. Like, the struggle is the tension. The struggle to get rid of the tension is the tension, and it's just layers and layers of that, fighting against whatever has kind of nested itself in here. And this feeling in particular for me, this, like, there's some part in here that really doesn't want to relax, and it comes up a lot. And it seems sometimes like Pandora's box, that the more I kind of look into it, the more emotion seems to come out of it. So yeah, I don't know exactly how that relates to what you just said, but that struggle to relax can really cause a lot of tension, when relaxing really just means let go of that struggle, and you can even just see it and see it as struggle, and that's it. You don't have to add to it. Like, that's just having some sense of equanimity. That's what it is. Period. Yeah. Any other lingering thoughts?
I just wanted to echo what's been said before and say thank you for the talk. It felt very heartfelt, and I resonated with a lot of it.
Appreciate that. Thank you, guys.
I feel a real sense of a community here.
Mm.
The way you present it and the way we respond. Thank you.
I also appreciate you guys for putting up with the stuffiness of the room. If this is your first time here, it is not like this often. It's the first time I've been in here and it's been this hot. So thank you.
It's so cool to hear about what your experience during the retreat was like, because like we have to do a lot of tasks together, like setting up the cushion for Soryu or doing various work around the building, and I had no idea, when I'm tapping you on the shoulder, like maybe that was going on in you at that moment.
Yeah, it is.
So, you've taught me a very interesting kind of yoga, and I'm curious if the metaphor of being in the river and seeing the scenery and just keeping with the flow as much as possible ever comes into play when you're doing that kind of yoga, and if you could explain, like, maybe any relationship between your sitting practice and that practice. If there is a link, I'm curious.
Yeah. Not that I've observed. For the record, there's a set of practices I do that I learned at a place called the American Yoga Foundation, which is in upstate New York, kind of just a small community of yogis that built the place themselves and developed a weird form of yoga that involves a lot of shaking and making noise and standing in weird ways. So I do that a lot, but as far as how this image of the river and the scenery comes in, I don't think it's any different from how it would be if you were in sitting meditation. I mean, the same thing is when you're doing the body work or when you're doing the yoga, there's still awareness of the breath and still awareness of that flow, except you're taking it more into action. There's more activity, things speed up a little more, things release more. Those areas that are holding on and really don't want to let go can, with astonishing speed, come up sometimes. It's just a matter of creating some space so that the bigger stuff can bubble up. And then you can laugh it out. Or cry it out, or scream it out, whatever.